Good evening. I will slowly start. I think we're up and running. My name is Nina Milligan, and I'm the chair of the Transportation Advisory Board. Now, since my screen is flashing, I'm thinking maybe we're starting again. So I will say that again. I'm Nina Milligan, chairman of the Transportation Advisory Board, opening this meeting of the board at 6:03 on November 19th. First of all, I'm going to call the roll of the members of the board who are here. And so when I say your name, then please unmute and say you're here. Marisol Visser.
Here.
Vice Chair Cynthia Crass.
I'm here.
Sujata Goyal.
Here.
And we don't have Tom McDonald here yet, but we will later. And for that reason, we're going to change the order of the meeting just a little bit. There are a couple of things that we have action and voting on, and we want to do that when Tom is here. Let me refer again to also, I'm sorry, that we have in attendance Stephen Padua, Senior Planner, and John Mortensen, Director of the Public Works. Did I get everybody, Stephen? I think so, Wallen and Tim Smith of AB. We have a couple people in the audience, and Stephen, you can help me with that when we get to audience comments, which, because we're moving approval of minutes out to a later time in the meeting, we'll go to public comments right now. And Stephen, since you're kind of at the controls, if you could help me bring those people into the meeting for their comments.
Sure, we have two callers in. First, I'll unmute Connie Marsh, who is called in.
Okay.
Okay.
So,
yep.
We're good?
Yep. Go ahead, Connie.
So, I'm Connie Marsh. I live on Squawk Mountain. And I was going to do my public comment in more story form this evening. I did send an email that hopefully everyone read. It was basically concerning the details of the complete streets language that you got in your agenda. So I want to tell you why I am concerned about our streets codes, because I don't think that most of you have been involved in the city and the way roads are built. So what we have in our town is we have public streets that we know, which are in a thing called right-of-way. Right-of-way is not zoned, and therefore things that are in the right-of-way don't go through the normal land use process. But what we have been having, and Newport Way is an example with all the building there, is we have a lot of development going on from private developers, and what they are doing is they are building segments of the public roads for us. And what this has done is this has created a very big confusion over what standards apply and who is in charge and who reviews those transportation projects. And because I'm a part of the public, the other thing that's super confusing is, when does the public get to see what is happening to the roads basically that they use every day? And so using Newport Way as an example, the Development Commission, which is a commission that makes real development decisions, is told that it does not have purview over the road improvements on Newport Way. And so they couldn't say anything about them. And then it turned into a very difficult situation where the road standards didn't match, and the community couldn't see anything that was going on. And it was impacting their lives because they live right there. And what I want to do is, when this type of language is put forth, I want to try to make sure that we are creating a system where all of the development speaks to each other and there is basically one standard that we are using as much as possible. There may have to be a few exceptions, so that it isn't a constant negotiation as to what the roads should look like. And in this situation, even what right-of-way is right-of-way a trail? Can it be a trail? I don't know. I went to the effort of, yeah.
Connie, can you
I'm
wrap
almost
up in
done.
about 15 seconds?
I can. I read
you.
other codes today that were more satisfying than the code that you were presented. Thanks.
Thank you, Connie. We allow a limited time for our public comments, about 3 minutes. Try to be a little generous
3
since we
minutes.
only have 2. But Stephen, can you dial up the next person? And when he does, unmute you and it's time to speak, please introduce yourself and your relation to the city.
So we have another caller on that's area code 206 ending with 14. I'm sending a request to unmute, but they're not unmuting.
Hi, this is Steve Pereira.
Okay,
I didn't have
there.
any comments, but my one comment is, I guess I strongly disagree with only 3 minutes for public comment period. City council is 5 minutes. I don't see why any other city commission or board is less than that 5 minutes designated, and I would like to see that revised to be 5 minute period. Thank you.
Okay, and then that is it for public comment. You're on mute right now, Nina.
Thank you, Stephen. Our little console keeps flashing at me and I don't always see when I'm not muted. Thank you, Connie and Steve, for coming to our meeting and commenting for the Transportation Advisory Board. Some of those comments are general, and I'm sure Stephen will take them into advisement when we are working on procedural things or on the topics more generally to perhaps what Connie was referring to. We do have another member of the board here. Tom McDonald, do you want to check your sound and see if we can hear you when you speak?
Hello, good evening.
Hello, thank you for coming. Then we'll call that a attendance call out for Tom, and so he is here. And we can now move to the approval of the minutes. Is that okay with you, Stephen, if we just get that out of the way? We have 3 meeting minutes in our packet. They are dated August 6th, September 1st, and October 14th. Is there anyone who wishes to comment or correct or change any of those minutes? I'm seeing none. Stephen, do I have to call a roll for this vote? Remind me.
You can just call for a general vote.
General vote of, can they just say approved? Yeah, okay. So let's put all these together since there were no comments. All in favor of approving the minutes of those 3 meetings, please raise your hand so I can see you and I will call it out. Thank you. That's unanimous. Cynthia, Marisol, Sujata, Tom, and Nina all voting yes to approve the minutes of those 3 meetings. Thank you. Boy, we got that off the table, Stephen. That's good. And then let's move into our agenda items. We have 3 tonight. We're going to go through the recommended update to the Complete Streets Policy Recovery Task Force meeting that was held on November 12th, the report on that, and the board schedule for our meetings in the rest of 2020 and 2021. And for that, in the first item about Complete Streets, I turn it over to Senior Transportation Planner for the City of Issaquah, Stephen Padua.
Great, thank you. So this item has been discussed by the TEB a few times over the last year. The board first got an introduction to it in the middle of 2019. And then there was further discussion later in 2019 on proposed concept changes. And then early in 2020, earlier this year, there was discussion on a draft. And then we brought it back later last month and revived that discussion to go over any final recommendations for the final draft. And then tonight we're proposed to take action on this. And just as a quick reminder, the purpose of this policy change is to update city code. And the purpose of this policy is actually to influence the type of street standards that the city enforces. By upgrading the language to be more consistent with the policies and guiding principles identified in the Mobility Master Plan, we have a stronger foundation for how we're enforcing our policies and implementing the plan itself. And the reason we're keeping the policy in city code is that it puts us in a better place to compete for federal and state grants. The national best practice for a complete streets policy is that it is adopted into city code. And so some grants will actually grade us on where we have the policy adopted. And so, you know, we had the choice of either keeping in city code, which is where it currently sits, or amending city code and putting it into the comprehensive plan as part of the whole master plan development process. And we had decided that keeping it in city code puts it in a better place to compete for those grants. And since our last discussion, we received a few edits that I want to show you tonight before we go into any further discussion on for final draft. And so I'm going to share my screen really quick and show you the first edit, which was to make sure you can see my screen first. Okay, can you all see my screen? Perfect. So the first edit is to the definition of connectivity, and the suggested edit was actually just to cut down the definition. There was really too much language there, more than what we really needed to define what connectivity was. And what I'll do is I'll go through the two edits, and then I'll open it up for discussion if that's okay with you, Nina. And then the other edit was in line with some of the feedback we received at the last meeting, which is that we wanted to keep the policy and the mobility master plan and the definition separated. And so this edit is actually to take out of the guiding principles out of the complete streets policy and just reference the guiding principles out of the mobility master plan. And we'll be doing the same type of edit over the mobility master plan where it directly references the city code for the complete streets policy. And then the other ask was for us to go over kind of the exemptions policy, or the exemptions portions of this policy update. And what I want to do is briefly explain the process of how this might work. And one example might be if a developer were to need a permit for a project where they have to request an exemption from the complete streets policy. What would happen is through our review process, multiple departments would actually be reviewing the permit. And so our planners and engineers would be reviewing the request and asking the developer to defend the need for the exemption. And what we would be asking for is actually going through this list of what's listed for the exemptions and having them to prove that they qualify for an exemption. And if they are reasonably, if they're reasonably in accordance with the guidance of this policy, we would then request permission from the city administrator to proceed with approval of the permit. If they didn't prove that they were in accordance with this policy guidance, then we would actually negotiate with them on the project and the permit process to ensure that they're adhering to this policy. And the same process would be applied for our Parks Department or even ourselves in Public Works when we move forward with implementation of our own projects. So I'll stop sharing my screen now.
This is Tom. I have a question. When we talk about negotiator, work with them, is that at a staff level or is that at a permit review level?
That's at the permit review level, which is among staff.
At this time, I think I would like to, we got a letter from the public that I'd like to just summarize it briefly to put into the record. Pardon me while I bring it up. This is a letter from Connie Marsh regarding the placement of the policy in Title 12 code, and Stephen addressed this issue, but it was regarding this, which is called a policy, and why is it placed in the code documents. There are several general comments about the effectiveness of the document and how will it get us where we're going. How, when road projects, how would they not be complete? Discussing the exemptions that we are going to be addressing, concern about the exemptions that we are talking about right now that Stephen just brought up. And another concern that this document be readable by the public and have a consistent pathway for everyone, and clearly state who the decision maker is and how you appeal a decision, and other concerns about conflicts or compatibility with other documents in the city policies, Title 18 being one of them. And I hope that all the commissioners have read that letter for detailed background information. And then when we could do this, to go through this review, Stephen, did you imagine that we might look together at your screen at each chapter and address questions about them and then have a discussion afterwards? How do you think would be the best now that we're looking at it for the third or so time? I have a few questions and others do too. How would you like to organize that?
Sure. If you have a specific section, I can share my screen if that's helpful, or we can just discuss it. It's however you want to do it.
I'm wondering if it would help the board if we had the document on the screen and we could just quickly scroll through it. I love that I want to say right off the bat that I like that you're doing a red line, and that a red line will help in the future to show the things that we have worked on and explain why they've changed. So up at the beginning where we have the introduction to the policy, we will, Tom, just one second. So we'll go through this section by section, I think, just to make sure that I can hear from everybody the definitions, the vision, these main headings. And so, Tom, if I could, can we focus our questions on the sections, unless, does anyone have something that they have a question about of the document in general? I see the Sujata does. And Tom, do you have a question about the document in general?
I was just going to point out that Sujata had a question. I didn't know if it was seen. You're on mute. Nina, you're on mute.
Sujata.
There we go. My question is in the exception section, so I will hold.
Very good. Thank you very much. Yes, and I do have my chat open now, and I'm now looking at it. So you may use that to tell me whether you have a comment. Are there any other questions or issues about the definitions? And if you could just kind of scroll through that quickly, Stephen, to the end. Seeing none, let's move on to the vision, I think is the next section.
This is Cynthia. I'm trying to make my notes jive. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I don't. Carry on. I'm just trying to make sure I understand where my notes, what pages my notes are referring to.
Are there any questions about the vision? I have a question, Stephen, and it kind of has to do with the vision, and that is that this states very generally the big thing, but what I couldn't really find, and I wondered if it should be here, is how do we get what we want. What we want are multimodal facilities, right? And this is the vision, not a street shall be something. Now that comes later, that it shall follow those standards on the later document. Is that where that goes? It doesn't go here. That
Yes.
because here it says you implement the complete street principles, but the principles aren't really here. Not all the principles are here, just that the system is safe, equitable, blah, 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 and all users. Are those the principles? The rest of that sentence?
Yes. Yeah, it is more of what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Cynthia, do you have a question?
I don't know how important this is, but I'll just bring it up. Number D, I noticed when we were meeting with council on the mobility master plan, I made an observation. I thought this was a little bit confusing, and I think we should just be explicit. It seems to me there's two concepts with maintenance, and one is including in normal budget cycles enough money for maintenance of what we already have alongside capital investments. But I also heard another concept that was making sure that when we do new projects, that how they are maintained and what the level of effort for maintaining them should also be considered when they're being designed. And I noticed listening to council, I thought we kind of went past it, but I thought they were actually not clear. I think they were interpreting it a couple different ways, and then we just kind of moved past it. So maybe the latter isn't important, but I did notice it was a bit of a source of confusion.
Thank you, Cynthia. Stephen, if you want to comment on that and how that plays into the MMP, you may.
And we're talking the section D that's listed underneath the vision that's currently crossed out.
Oh crap! I'm looking at the old one. Yeah. So.
Okay. Well, so to answer your question though, this was primarily this is one of the guiding principles. So when in the section in the mobility master plan, when it's talking about the guiding principles, we actually go into more detail of when maintenance should be considered and what the length of or the scope of how much maintenance should be considered with each of the projects.
But I
that are being
think
developed.
The way it's described, at least the stuff that's crossed out, makes it sound like as you're budgeting and deciding how much to spend on maintenance and how much to spend on new projects. I think those are two different ideas, and I think they get conflated the way they're described.
Right. Yeah, and that's another reason for us to kind of cross this off of adding it to the complete streets policy is only because it doesn't have that same context that it does in the mobility master plan.
So this is Tom. To ask a question, then back to Cynthia and to you. Is that reference when they're designing streets and they look at the long-term maintenance of the streets, is that then addressed elsewhere within the mobility master plan?
Yes.
Okay. So this is basically just crossing this out because it's redundant with what's in the MMP already. Okay.
Correct. And yes, that was part of the suggestion to cross it out, was to reduce a lot of that redundancy, but also to minimize the need for if this changes in the future, we're not having to make a change to this policy in addition to making a change to the mobility master plan. So it's just strictly just referencing rather than trying to use the same language.
Thank you. I see Sujata has a question.
Thank you. So I guess my question is to follow on to what Nina was saying about the vision and sort of the standards. So in this section, we outline what we want as a vision for what our streets are. And then later on, we talk about sort of the standards that are supposed to help us achieve that vision. So I'm just wondering, do we want to, somehow reference the fact that that further below in the standard section will be how we achieve this vision? Or I think as people are reading the document, they'll know that the standards sort of outline what we want our streets to look like in order to get to this vision. Maybe that's enough, but it could be a way to cross-reference. And then the other thing it could potentially do is in the future, if standards change, and I don't think this would happen, but, you know, move away from a concept of complete streets, or all of a sudden we're back to 80s, you know, 5-lane car build outs or something, then maybe as the standards are evolving to sort of a different type of lifestyle, we can go back and say, hey, our vision was this, and now these standards don't necessarily apply, and so we should keep checking back with our vision.
Thank you, Sujata. Stephen, one thing that comes to mind with that is if this had a table of contents at the beginning of the heading.
The way all this is written is actually to go straight into city code. So these sections will actually be put together, and it'll show up basically like a table of contents where you'll break it out based on the policies.
Okay, great. Ready to move on? I don't see anybody else in chat. Let's move on to the next section. And we're kind of mixing questions and comments here, Stephen, so I hope you don't mind, just so we can get through all of this. I didn't have any questions on this section, and I'm looking in the chat to see if anybody else does. I think we're okay. Let's move on. We can always come back if we miss you. And then here's the part about the exceptions, which Stephen described, gave it some context and some further information. Does anyone have a question about this section?
I do, Nina.
Okay, please
about
go.
The one exception, and I think I mentioned it in one of the past meetings, I can't remember. The one exception I was wondering about, so, you know, there's obviously the cost prohibitive, and maybe this other section would drive it, is the notion of environmental impact. Because sometimes as we're trying to fit complete streets, I mean, you know, in my work building long linear projects, as we're trying to fit, you know, a standard into a certain place, you know, there's cost impact, but there's also environmental impact. So like me living on the side of Cougar, this idea of trying to put a complete street in that area and what kind of impact it could potentially cause to the hillside, or, you know, to the environment. And so maybe knowing what that impact could be to the environment in the area, then that means, you know, maybe then the city decides never to repave or restripe that road, and it just leads to badness. So I'm just wondering if there is a way to sort of identify the potential of impact to, you know, in places where they cause significant impact to environment. And again, maybe the cost picture piece deals with that, but, you know, part of our vision for a complete street is, you know, to address global climate change. And if we can just ensure that maybe our policies are also being sensitive to the climate around us.
Maybe we can play with that a little bit, and maybe add a little bit of language that kind of, I'll just use the previous policy. And
it should be significant. I mean, I don't know how significant is significant, or how I'll let the wordsmith people come up with that. I mean, it shouldn't be a loophole for people to just get out of having to build the infrastructure, but there are real places where there is a significant negative impact to the environment. So
I have a question. The last three paragraphs are the same in this one and the other one, so I don't see why there's a red line for a change in them, since they seem to be reading identical.
That's just to show that they were previously changed from the last draft.
Okay.
And right now, I'm just showing the red line for just from last meeting to this meeting. And so this new let's say section F, Sujata, is that kind of fit the bill? Or are you wanting something more of it has significant negative impact, environmental impact? The trick is we're going to have a new environmental board soon who's going to be helping define new environmental policies, and I want to make sure it's consistent as possible, but at the same time not being contradictory to what might be put together by that new board.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I was thinking in doing this. And so maybe, I mean, I know later on we have context sensitivity and we mention, you know, kind of environmental impact. But if we're going through the trouble of listing exceptions, I just feel like, I mean, because I don't know if the city does salmon safe or if we're moving toward that, or if the city is going to look at, you know, trying to achieve other environmental measures. So I just want to make sure that our roads and our facility development is not contradictory to any of the other policies that we would be trying to implement as a city, and you know, focus on climate is a big deal. So I don't know if we can defer at this point to a future climate board to come up with the words around this, but
what I could do is work with our environmental staff and come back to you with a sentence that might fit kind of what you had in mind. Would that work?
yeah, I think that would be that makes sense. I can't wordsmith on. I spent a little bit of time trying to figure out where I'm not a wordsmither, so I can't come up with the answer at the moment. But really, just trying to make sure that in our drive for complete streets, you know, we're also making, you know, looking at the city's values holistically and
Sure.
addressing that issue.
And what we can do is include for when we take action for this item, just include that, you know, pending this amendment based on new language that would be included by some environmental staff.
Yeah, and whether, you know, it's the environmental, because I'm assuming then, yeah, if we're having an environmental board in the city, they're going to have some really clear ideas of how they want the city to be developing the city. So whatever their standards are seem appropriate.
Great, thank you, Sujata. And you, yeah, and Stephen, you might be able just to put the word right before environmental to the city's goals to address climate change, because they certainly live somewhere, and they're there already in some form, and they will be revised and improved by the environmental board in the future. And so that way, at least it's giving a reference to go look over there at those standards before you do, when you're looking at this. Yeah, okay. And then talking with your staff in that department would be very helpful. I had another question about the paragraph with the city administrator. I'm looking around to see the room. Is there anybody else in the room? No. Question I had for you, Stephen, about the decision residing with the city administrator. When you verbalized how this all works, it all sounds great. But when I just read it, it doesn't say that to me. And I wondered, is there an identifier in the city manual that says what this kind of review is called? You know, like the level 3 or level 1, level 2 reviews that we have when they talk about whether they go through the city council and all that kind of thing. You said that when a city administrator reviews this, they reach out to department heads, and it's not just one person, it's all people. So this looks like it's one person. How would this reflect what you narrated to be the way that it really happens?
Sure, it's through kind of the permit review process. It's going to be reviewed by multiple departments, and for being a transportation policy, our group would be reviewing this element of the review process and making the judgment on whether or not a developer, for just going back to my example, is justifying the need for an exemption. And if they are showing that they're doing that, then we would go to the city administrator for the approval. And then that would be the same for any other department. So if it was a parks project and they were trying to push for an exemption for one of their projects, they would need the city administrator's approval. And maybe that would be better language I have here is more of the city administrator approval, more so than having to submit it directly to the city administrator. Would that kind of fix some of the issue?
The issue with me is that it resides, it sounds like it resides with a single person's review and decision, which does not reflect what you had said, that is taking in the expertise of the other departments. But then another thing, well, let's start with that.
So
If it said after city administrator in that middle paragraph, if it said in the after the city administrator words, shall reside with the city administrator after departmental review, or something that is, or after the permit review, or something that's reflecting that this goes through this, like what you just said. How can you make it say what you just said? Anyway, you can come back to that. It's hard to draft on the fly, but
well, let's start with the language you actually just said.
okay. Following departmental review. That helps flesh this out at least a little bit, and
Okay.
let's go with that as an incremental improvement. And then let me ask a question on the next part, unless there's somebody else with a question. Doing okay right now. Go ahead and put in the chat if you have a question or comment. The next part has to do with exceptions granted shall be publicly reported. Now, this means then when somebody is requesting an exception, it doesn't become public until after they've received approval. What good does that do? You know what I mean? What's the purpose of making it public after it's been approved?
Just to show that an exemption was allowed.
It sounds like the question is, when it's submitted, is it someone who's can look at it and question it, when it's under review, as opposed to waiting until it's finalized and approved or disapproved before they can see it? Is that the question that you're thinking of, Nina?
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to remember back when we last.
Yeah, so
I'm sorry, Tom.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Steve.
Oh, I was actually letting you speak.
It seems like once it's submitted, it'd be on some page saying that this was submitted for a variance or review. So someone who's watching or someone who's looking for something would be able to see that's under review before it's finalized.
And, you know, in this case, I'm thinking of the kinds of things that we do when there are neighbors involved or neighboring properties. How would they know in advance that an exception is being considered? Sujata has a question. Can I go to Sujata, please?
Yeah, and this is sort of relevant to the timing of, you know, when you're saying, because if in this policy we're saying that it would be during initial project planning, so that could be like planning phase pre 30%, definitely pre 60%, and so public comment and public review doesn't normally happen until 60% at SEPA. So yeah, so I agree with sort of what the others on the board are saying, is that if somebody wants an exception and they're sort of rolling in at the pre 60% for getting that exception, then how do we make sure that at some point there was a touch point with at least the adjacent property owners to say, if not, you know, the people in the vicinity to say, hey, these people want an exception, this is what this frontage is going to look like. You know, how does the community agree or not? And so in this policy sort of, because we're asking for information for that exception so early in the process, that means that the public would have never seen or had the opportunity to provide comment.
Yeah, there might be two phases of that. One might be when, like, if initial concept of something can be developed, they submit that. That might be one, like, gate as far as review of whether the project as a whole. The other, when you get to 60%, you're pretty well in design. At that point, an exception would be more for, as engineering's gone on, now they have another issue and they would like an exception for that issue, which may be a way to keep from going back and redesigning it. But that would be the second point where I think the variance might be asked for.
I think this is
Or an
bringing
exception.
up a fairly complicated topic and maybe something Stephen needs to take with him. Could you just put a little note to return there somewhere and then take home all our ideas with you? Well, you're
This looks like the perfect spot for a process flow diagram. Input, output.
You know, I think what I'll do is I'll reach out to our permitting staff to see how to make that work, where there's kind of an initial review phase for any exemptions that might come up through the permitting process well before that 60% design portion.
Yeah, and some kind of using a procedure that we already have.
I'm just going to add this in just as a note. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you to the members of the board. Anything else on this exceptions section? Seeing none, let's move on to the next one, which is interjurisdictional. Any comments about this one? Let's go on to the next one. Best practices and standards. I don't see any questions in the comment. Stephen, I want to ask you a question to maybe give this some context. When I read this, well, the way that it read to me, that's what I mean to say, is that when we have all projects are going to go through a review with every single one of these, and each of these have standards and guidelines. It sounded huge and like a huge kind of review, and that do all these agree with one another? Do they overlap? How would you put all projects through review through all of these 1 through 5? And is that what it says? Is that what you meant it to say?
So, I mean, just looking at the first line, it's more along the lines of all projects shall follow best practices. And then the list below is more of this. These include all these different guidelines or best practices or national recommendations that are out there. Not necessarily that one project's going to have to follow all of them. It's more of whichever one is best applied. It'll make sense to follow those best practices. Does that answer your question?
Only sort of, and because I'm not familiar with these documents like you would be, if this is a shall, and that's why I'm giving it such weight. This is a shall follow best practices. So is this referring to, in these documents, a section that says best practices? And I'm thinking, like, you know, the width of a bike lane. If there's a best practice that the width of a bike lane is 12 feet. Is that the same in all these? I mean, if it's following best practices, how do you know which ones to choose and what are they? And probably using a bad example because that's probably the street standards.
The hierarchy of what, like when you have plans, specs, special provisions, special, like what has a hierarchy, if there are conflicts or differences between them, how would that be resolved?
So to answer your question, there actually isn't, they don't contradict each other. All these are kind of specialized on certain areas of kind of the transportation system. And so but if there is kind of two guidelines with somewhat contradicting recommendations, then it's kind of put to engineering judgment on which standard that we want to apply in the city of Issaquah.
Okay, let me put it this way too. Thank you very much. That's a good answer. Does this create a checklist for you when you say that we shall follow the best practices? Is there how does that work?
Well, John and I know all of these and have read them through detail. So in terms of a checklist, their checklist is kind of in our brain of, okay, they're asking for a bike lane. I know to go to the green book on this section that's going to provide for this type of situation. So yes, there's a checklist, but it's not necessarily needing to be defined here.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else have questions or comments about this section? I have only one more, but I'm looking for you guys. Sujata, please.
Yeah, and then the only other question / comment I would have on this section is with the FHWA guidelines. Would that, I'm assuming that's only, I mean, not that they're necessarily contradictory, but sometimes FHWA asks for extra stuff. And so I'm just wondering, would we only apply the FHWA if federal monies were involved? Or would we try to, they have all those certifications and blah, blah, blahs in their, requirements because it's a federalized, federally funded project. And so sometimes their level of scrutiny or requirement is a bit higher. So, just wondering if that's if only, so shall is, NACTO, ASHTO, that all makes sense. But then maybe FHWA is only when federal funds apply, because there's a bunch of stuff in their guidelines that if you don't have to, you really don't want to meet those standards.
So there's certain documents that we definitely need to follow every details. The manual for uniform traffic control devices is one of those documents. But then there's the bicycle selection guide, and even in that document itself, it says this is a national best document of national best practice to be paired with other national best practices, and it references the other ones, the other documents kind of listed above it. So it's more on the other documents actually provide more detail that are going to be more applied for more of our situations, as for what federal FHWA puts out is a little more selective in terms of the type of details they put out. They'll say you want at least a 5-foot bike lane, and then the urban bikeway design guide will say, if you have a curb, you want it this wide. If you have a buffer, you want it this. So it goes a lot more detail. So the federal FHWA documents don't necessarily go to the level of detail that we usually want.
Anything else, Sujata, right now? Anybody else? I have one more comment on this page for the last paragraph. It refers to if we have federally funded projects, it'll supersede our local requirements in this policy. Can you give me an example of this? And the reason I'm bringing it up as a concern is that to me, this read that we would forego our standards, forego our goals if somebody else was paying for it. And that just didn't sound right to me. We wouldn't set up standards and say, yeah, but it's okay if somebody else is paying, then I don't care about my standards. That's kind of the way this read to me. Did I read that correctly?
Kind of. A good way to put it is typically the federal standards, or for federally funded projects, we have to follow the federal standards by very, even the smallest detail. But it's not necessarily in the sense of if they say we have to have a 5-foot bike lane, we have to have a 5-foot bike lane. It's more of the situation of, we'll use East Lake Sammamish as a good example, that there's a sound wall over there. We don't necessarily have a standard of facilities surrounding a sound wall, but WSDOT and the federal government does. And so we would have to follow their standard of what would need to go there based on, and whether we had one or not, we typically, cities typically won't. We would have to follow their standard to answer your question. And that's required for all federally funded projects.
Yeah, I can see the reason for having this. I wanted to consider whether this would put us in a circumstance where we might accept funds and do something that is less than our standards, but I don't know if that is the concern. If usually these standards are higher or more rigorous than ours, then okie dokie. But if it causes us to reduce the performance of our standards, that's where I was concerned.
No,
just
it's
kind of leave that with you.
yeah, no, it's very rarely will we find ourselves kind of in a situation where, and I know you're kind of thinking around safety of if if we have a fairly funded project where we put in a trail, they say it needs to be 10 foot, we want it 15 feet. They're never really going to have that type of requirement for those type of projects.
Okay.
Their requirement will be, if we say we want to put in a trail, we have to put in a trail, and we can't change our mind later.
Okay, let's, I don't see anybody else raising their hands or putting in a comment. Let's go on to the next section. See, we are going overtime on this topic, so sorry, Stephen.
That's okay. It's all kind of a guess of depending on what we need.
Okay, this is on context sensitivity. We already talked about this a little bit earlier. Does anybody have any questions or comments about this right now? Cynthia, you have the floor.
So I don't have a super coherent comment, but the thing about context sensitivity that struck me is that this is really, really important. And as I was rereading pages 1 through 6, I was kind of looking for these things. And then when I got to this page, I said, oh, great. All of my notes I just crossed out because it was addressed by this. And one of the things that jumps out at me is the human scale. I think complete streets, I've been in cities in California where the complete streets end up being, a quarter mile wide to cross because they put everything in there and lost track of what it really is the goal. But I just was wondering how I guess it's all captured in the exceptions, but how this doesn't end up getting kind of worked. Context sensitivity is really, really important, but it almost seems like it's an excuse to sort of make up your own rules. And so I don't know what to do about that, because I do believe that the flexibility and all the things in this captured in this are important. So I guess it's kind of two comments. One is does it make any sense to put it earlier? Because I just think it's such an important overriding concept. And the second thing is, how do we make sure that somebody who's required to build a complete street doesn't use flexibility as a way? How does flexibility that's so important in context sensitivity not become a way to be inconsistent with how the policy is administered? And maybe that's not to be answered here, but I just think this is like where the rubber meets the road.
Stephen, do you want to comment on that? And then I go to Sujata after that.
Okay, so to respond to your comment question, Cynthia, is that we wanted to have language that was going to be consistent with what's in the mobility master plan. And there's a lot more detail around how to implement content sensitivity per mode in the mobility master plan. And that's where we wanted to leave a lot more of the implementation. We wanted to make sure that, as you said, we wanted to make sure the language and the policy was there for complete streets. It doesn't matter if it moves earlier in the policy or not to us. If it makes sense to the board, we're happy to move that up. The main thing is we wanted to make sure the language was consistent with what's in the mobility master plan.
Cynthia, do you have a follow-up?
No, I just think maybe if we're going to increase readability, maybe I'm the only one that thinks this, but it just seems like a lot of the things that popped into my head as I was reviewing this were answered then here. So it might be useful for the reader, but I don't feel super strongly about it. It's not a very long document, so it's not a huge deal.
Well, if it helps, Cynthia, I totally agree with you that chapter order could be improved a little bit, especially by moving this up and moving exceptions down, getting the things that we want to do up in front and the things that we will maybe consider if we can't do them, put that later. So that's an easy fix, isn't it? Let's go to Sujata.
So I actually think the opposite of what Cynthia and Nate are saying. And I apologize. And really for me, the reason is because when you read code or, you know, the way it's being written is that it's like, here's our vision, then here are the hows to get to our vision. So these are the planning documents you want to, you know, the NACTO and whatever guidelines that you want to follow. In case you can't do that, or here are some exceptions we have to that. You know, our vision is X, here are the exceptions to our vision, you know, cost, environment, whatever. If you can't, you know, but what we want to see are these very kind of the guidelines of the, you know, best professional engineers out there. These are the standards they've established. You shall implement these things. And then it says, here's what you know, as you're doing those things, just also be aware. So I think, you know, when you're trying to, so for me, when you're trying to balance getting people to achieve your vision with making sure that your vision isn't so dogmatic that there's no opportunity for flexibility, I feel like stating your vision and the ultimate kind of how you want it to look on the ground first, and then saying, but in the case of context, if it can't happen later, for me, that feels like a better balance of stating your vision, stating what you want it to look like, and then providing that sensitivity. So it's really a formatting thing and a personal preference, but yeah.
Thank you, Sujata. These are all the comments I've seen for this section. Stephen, do you have anything else you want to say about that?
Before we move on, could we get a little more discussion on what we want with this section?
Looking around the room, see if anybody has something they want to say. I'm just going to go down. Sujata, anything else about this?
No, and again, you know, if you guys, I don't feel strongly about it either way. I mean, I think ultimately Cynthia's right. We're all trying to figure out how to balance a desire to see our vision implemented with a desire to know that it's context sensitive. And so to me, you know, however we order it, if you two have you know, if the rest of the board has an opinion that's stronger one way, I'm totally flexible.
I guess maybe we don't want to spend too much time on this because maybe we're just kind of guessing at how it would be, what the impact of the decision would be. But I kind of go back to who the audience is, and if you're, you know, trying to figure out what's expected of you as you're proposing a project, what do we want to lead with? I feel like this kind of gets at the idea of what you do, where you're doing it, and I think not just exceptions, but actually really understanding the context that you're working in, and that just seems like a supremely important thing. But I also think Sujata makes a good case, so I'm okay if we want to let staff decide. I don't know.
Okay, let's keep going down. Marisol, do you have anything that you want to say about it?
I would say that I think it makes more sense if it's upper up. So that's one of the first things you see, just to, you know, to have a context in whatever we are going to be reviewing after. But again, I think it should be up.
Okay, and then Tom, do you have a comment about this?
No additional comments, except for, you know, reading the one includes a shift toward design at the human scale for the needs and comfort of all the people and travelers, and considering issues such as street width, operating speed, hierarchy of streets, and stuff like that. I mean, it reads, I kind of know what it's saying, but it also seems to be able to do that, but within the context of the complete streets and context I can sort of design to be able to have that in it. So I think I'm just thinking out loud and understanding it out loud. So I don't think I have any other comments, if that makes any sense.
Thank you, Tom. Stephen, does that give you everything you need?
Just by pure numbers, I'm leaning towards moving it up.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. We can move on to the next topic. Does anyone have any comments about the performance measures and the reporting on the efficacy of this policy?
Sorry, Nina, I do. I
Please go.
couldn't decide if it was faster to type or just raise my hand. So the only one I was wondering about, because one of the other things we talk about is sort of these, and maybe that gets covered in modal share, but we talk about some of these more innovative, whether it's app-based or data trackers or, ride share or, some of these more kind of innovative technology type functions. And so with those, which is, how do you more efficiently get people around your city? These kind of infrastructure measures wouldn't necessarily get to, some of those kind of innovations. And I feel like if the city, were to start a bike share program, not that I would advocate for that, but if the city were to start something like that, then we would want to somehow be able to reflect, the time and energy, effort, resources we put into that through our measurement of that. So I don't know if it's some sort of like metric associated with just a general statement around metric associated with innovative technologies or something, but it sort of starts to define innovative ways that people are getting around. So it'd be interesting and I think important to measure that maybe.
Thank you, Sujata. Sorry. Can I just follow up with what you're saying in that, Stephen, can you refer to, this is a complete streets policy and there may be reporting on the kinds of mode share and transportation applications in the infrastructure, could be somewhere else, and just kind of give us some context on that.
Sure. So for these performance measures, we primarily wanted to address a lot of the main performance measures that were kind of called out in the mobility master plan. We also want this language to be consistent with the performance measures that are going to be reported out to city council and the community on a more regular basis. In regards to Dada's comment on, if we were to take on bike share or some type of new technology, typically through like a pilot program or any type of new program, we would be reporting out on those specific programs individually with their own kind of performance metrics. And so we didn't feel like we needed that type of language here, which is why, because we kind of go through that process with more individualized programs and pilot projects. But we can add language in there if that doesn't make enough sense.
Oh, no, if you guys are reporting it somewhere else, then I think that's, I just wanted to make sure that the city was getting credit where credit is due for innovations that we would implement. And then I actually had another question on the measures, and this is specifically around the equity measure. And equity is always a real challenge to figure out how to sort of appropriately measure. And I think the equity, or I think the one, I appreciate the fact that we are specifically calling out our desire to see more equity in our transportation system, and that therefore we considered a value to measure that. And so I like the public feedback as a potential stand-in for an equity measure, but one of the things I'd really like, and I don't know, I can't remember in our city, you know, for some of the other, like in the recreation world, there's that, you know, access, you know, with an eighth of a mile of walkable public, you know, public access to a bike lane, or, you know, safe sidewalks in communities, or, you know, whatever it may be. But, you know, one of the things, I think this is a good start, but I'd really, I don't know enough about how the city breaks down with, you know, the way our income and, you know, kind of how people live based on sort of that, or our health outcomes. But I'd love to maybe see or challenge ourselves to work with more public health data and, you know, parks data and that kind of data, to see if there's a way we could create a potentially more robust measure for the city about, you know, putting our money where our mouth is and making sure that some of our least accessible communities get as much, you know, infrastructure, get the infrastructure they need. So, but I do appreciate the fact that it's in there.
Stephen, I'll leave it to you to comment or reply.
Sure. No, so John, I really actually appreciate the question, comment. The city, we have, I don't know how many of you are kind of familiar with the Health and Equity Action Plan that's kind of been in development. Separate from that process, we've actually had several staff teams working on health and equity and trying to address certain issues that have you know, that have come up, but more so been lingering, and how best to address equity in the city. And transportation is one of those issues where we've been trying to think about how to really address a lot of the access issues. And when we looked at the availability of data specific to the city as well, it was very difficult to really find something that was relevant to transportation and access. And so that's why we're kind of starting with this starting point, is because it's very difficult for us to be more specific on a performance metric when it comes to transportation access. We can definitely piggyback off of King County Metro and a lot of their work when it comes to access to transit services, but that's not something that we do as a city. And so while we will definitely be working with Metro to get access to that data and have that type of information available to the community, it's hard for us to hold ourselves accountable to that. And that's really the reason why it's kind of at this starting point, is because we're still kind of developing this whole idea on how the city is going to address equity. And next year, we're going to be working on the development of a racial equity framework, which I believe will help us get at this racial equity performance metric a lot better. So my only suggestion right now is to kind of leave it as it is, unless the board is more comfortable with having something a little more specific. But that's just kind of a reason on why the language is as it is. But I completely agree with you, Sujata. We definitely should be holding ourselves accountable to a much higher level, and which is what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and again, I think this is a really, really good first step. But, you know, so maybe one of the things, I don't know, with mapping data, the public health agencies, you know, they have those areas with low health outcomes. And so I don't know if I think they might do it by zip versus postal code level. So if it's by zip, then with the city of Issaquah, that gets really challenging, because, you know, we have about 2 zip codes. So it may not get us to the granular level, but that could potentially, you know, if we overlaid our sidewalk and whatever network to that, you know, data point. But again, it just may be too
course.
aggregate for,
Yeah.
it's coarse for our needs, but
Don't they do census block data?
yeah, again, I don't know. That's why I'm not sure.
It's interesting.
It depends on what you're looking for from public health. But even at the census block level, it's still hard to even get to the neighborhood level to make an assessment of equity.
Okay, are there any other questions about this section on performance measures? Not seeing
I
any.
have,
I see one from Marisol.
yes, thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, Marisol. Thank you very much.
Don't worry. So Stephen, I have a question about if we add anything about the equity, which I also really appreciate that we are taking into account. You mentioned about the metrics from Metro. Is there any specifics that they have right now that we could be using, or have you seen anything?
They have data specific to access to the access services or the on-demand services. It gets a little more difficult otherwise because they don't really track that level of data for the fixed route services. They don't necessarily say at this particular stop there were 2 pickups where someone with a disability or any demographic level data that would be usable for us, but for access or for the on-demand services, they have a little more specifics, but even that's very slim for the city of Issaquah.
Sorry, I have another comment. I'm thinking about the use of the Orca cards, and you know how there are these programs who offer Orca cards for our citizens. So I wonder if there's any metrics on that from the organizations who provide those.
There are. The difficulty is the issuance of Orca cards for like large employers. They just have it'll be difficult to get employee level information. So if one major employer has 3 active Orca Lift cards, it's Metro won't really necessarily have access to who specifically that is without having to go through the employers first.
Thank you. More to think about it.
Yeah, no, we've been working through kind of the equity and transportation and access for over a year now, and it's really difficult for the city as well to really get at that granular level that we're trying to get to. So for a start, this is kind of the language we were comfortable with, but we're happy to work with the board on adding any additional language.
Thank you, everybody. I think that we can move on to the next topic now, but chime in if I'm missing you. Stephen, I'm not seeing any questions right away. If you have any comments you might like to provide to give us some ideas about what you're trying to accomplish here.
Sure. The idea behind the language that's put together for the implementation step is to kind of give us the flexibility to work with the language that's in the mobility master plan and make sure that there's consistent language between the two. We want to be able to describe how implementation is going to work when using the complete streets policy, but not necessarily get into the specifics that are more identified in the mobility master plan and the citywide strategic plan.
I have a question inspired by this one. In the first paragraph where it says, the public works staff shall routinely reference, and this is kind of like earlier in the document where you make use of the best practices in these other documents. How would anyone know that you are routinely referencing the mobility master plan in implementing these steps? How would someone know?
I mean, typically people are going to find the mobility master plan first before they even find the complete streets policy, and that's kind of a typical process flow when it comes to looking at the different policies. Just like when we started this process, most people didn't even know we had a complete streets policy, but most people knew we had a transportation element, or they knew we were working on the mobility master plan. It's kind of how the flow of information goes when it comes to these policies.
Let me rephrase my question a little bit. And thank you for that, all the same. Public Works staff shall routinely reference. Say there was a disagreement somewhere down the road, and somebody said, I don't like the decision about this, that, or the other thing, or how you built this thing. And you wanted to say, but I followed the implementation step, and I routinely referenced the MMP. How would you be able to prove that you satisfied this shall?
How I would show that I met the shall, at least the component of in this policy.
Yes, if it's a shall, it would have to be enforced somehow. And if you can't prove it, how would you enforce it? What would be the point of saying shall here?
Oh, I see. It's along the lines of kind of the next step after updating this policy. It's the update to our street standards, and that's where a lot of the implementation and enforcement of what is trying to get achieved in the complete streets policy. That's where a lot of the enforcement comes in. That's where the details of the width of bike lane in a certain situation, or the type of walkway that we want, and the type of standard that we want in any type of situation based on the project. That's where we're showing the implementation, or at least the proof of implementation of the complete streets policy. Does that help answer your question? At least better?
Yeah, a little bit. And what I'm getting at here is, if we're going to say shall, we would have to prove that we did. And there are a couple soft things here, routinely. Well, what does routinely mean? Every time an application comes in, every time there's a permit, every time whatever, what would be the routine that you're measuring? And you're doing it to ensure progress is being made. So these shalls are being attached to things that might be very difficult to measure. And that's where I was going with that.
I see. So in our regular reports to the Transportation Advisory Board on project progress, or to the city council or the city administration, we're required to actually show which policies we're enforcing when it comes to enforcement of the mobility master plan, what's in the transportation element of the comp plan, even the land use component of the comp plan. Like if there's any implementation showing, or even, I'm sorry, the citywide strategic plan, because there's very specific actions that we're supposed to be taking on in the next 5 years. We have to be showing that we're implementing and enforcing those, and so that's where we'll be referencing the progress.
Yeah, that's what I think I was trying to ask. Are there any other questions from the board? Thank you. Stephen, is this the end of this document, and have we completed the review here, and what's next?
That's it. The next step is I will quickly summarize kind of the changes that staff will work on, and then ask the question if the board is in a comfortable spot to take action. So very quickly, just starting at the beginning, there's the initial edit to the definition of connectivity, cutting it short. There is the cutting out the mobility master plan guiding principles and just making it a reference as part of the second section in the vision. We will be moving, adding a sentence more specific to the environmental goals and addressing climate change as part of the exceptions, and making sure there's no contradictory or negative impact to the environment, as well as adding in a sentence, working with the permitting staff to add in a sentence on how to identify a kind of an early review process as part of any project design to address any exceptions that may come up. The other major change was to move the context sensitivity section. And I think what I'll do is move this after, kind of on the second section after definitions, but before the vision. I think that makes the most sense in terms of where to move it. So that way context sensitivity is really first and up front following the definitions. Is that consistent with what I heard from the board?
I'd like to hear from Cynthia, but remember you have a chapter called Vision, which is a good place to start too.
Totally busted. You just said you want to hear from me, and I was distracted. I'm totally busted. I don't know what the question was.
Cynthia, if you would, if we're moving the context sensitivity chapter earlier in the document, would you put it right after definitions, after vision, or another suggestion?
After vision.
After vision? Okay. Then
Thank you.
other major change. Actually, that was the last major change. Is that consistent?
So it
Did I
sounds
miss
like
anything?
yeah, I think we got it.
Okay.
The to clarify, is this a motion and a vote, and is it to recommend that somebody after us, like City Council, adopts us, or what is the specific action, please?
So the proposed action is recommendation to the City Council to amend City Code 12.10, specifically the Complete Streets policy.
Okay, do I have a motion from anybody?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Yes. Second the
Thank you,
motion
Tom.
to amend it.
Moved by Cynthia and seconded by Tom, and I will take a roll call vote. And when I call your name, just say your name and your vote. And I'm just going the way you guys look on my screen. So Marisol Visser,
Yes.
Cynthia Crass,
Yes.
Tom McDonald,
Tom McDonald, yes.
Sujata Goyal.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I got everybody. Nina Milligan, yes. Unanimous vote to recommend approval to the city. Does that do it for you, Stephen, on that section of the agenda?
Yes, it is.
Excellent. We can we took up as much time on the first section as we have proposed to take on the second. So I'm hoping that Stephen can find a clever way to get us through the Recovery Task Force meeting on November 12th presentation. We set aside quite a bit of time for that, but can you do it quicker, Stephen?
I believe I can. I'm going to share my screen. Get to the presentation. So the purpose of this whole discussion on the Recovery Task Force is to discuss and ask from the Mayor's Recovery Task Force, which was to have boards, commissions provide recommendations for recovery from the pandemic in 2021. And they're specifically looking for any potential actions that the city can take on as part of recovery in the first 6 months in 2021. And so on November 12th, the Recovery Task Force met and invited all the chairs for all the boards and commissions. And each board and commission was asked to give a brief update from each of the group's works plans, and to go into a little more detail of what the task force is asking of each of the boards and commissions. Nina, did you have anything to kind of add quickly on the November 12th meeting?
Only that we shared our plan, and because we are a new board, that was really a great forum to be able to get some visibility to the work that we're doing. But that the compatibility of some of the projects of the Recovery Task Force, such as the Streetery and the Transportation Advisory Board, exploring pedestrian zones or mobility, or revisiting what our streets do. That was a very interesting combination that came forth in the task force meeting and in all the task force deliberations.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do is give very brief updates, considering the time that's left for tonight's meeting, just to give you an idea of the context of each of these items when it comes to the transportation system, to kind of help with the discussion tonight of what type of recommendations we might want to make, or the board might want to make to the Recovery Task Force. Does that work, Nina?
Yes, go for it, Stephen.
Okay. So really quick, for transit, the update on transit is that ridership is down close to 60 to 80%, depending on the route, depending on the service. Van pools use is down 90%. There's been significant cuts and reallocation of services to areas of the region to best serve where essential workers need access to transit. And what we see is essentially our new base network for transit in the city of Issaquah today. And for Metro, their financial forecast, looking over for the next 10 years, is they're seeing a $2 billion revenue gap, which is going to be cutting into any potential implementation of their long-range plan, Metro Connects. To kind of give you some perspective of that amount, King County's just recently adopted their budget, and Metro's total budget for 2021 and 2022 was $2.1 billion. So a $2 billion shortfall over the next 10 years is quite a bit. And so without any additional financial help, it's going to be difficult to add a lot more services to what a lot of the cities are looking for. To go to walking and biking, the general trends that we're seeing around the region is that more people want to walk or roll outside, and it's significantly changed how we look at access to our system and how we explore more opportunities to get people outside, which is where the growing demand is. It's also spurred stronger support for more creative ideas to allow people to be outside. A similar idea might be the streetery issue that Nina had brought up, and to provide more service areas. And so one of the creative ideas to go along what regional efforts are going on is that many cities have taken on the idea of a healthy streets initiative, and what this is it creates more of an open space for people to be outside and feel safe. And it's a relatively inexpensive project to implement. And the way it works is you use temporary signage to close designated residential streets, providing some enforcement and some education, or at least communication with the community about what these closures are, and it provides local access still. So it's more about cutting down a lot of the pass-through traffic and volumes. And cities who have implemented it over at least the course of this pandemic have found 60 to 90% cuts in pass-through traffic and significant reduction in speeds and general volume. And so the feedback on a lot of these streets tend to be mixed depending on location, depending on the people providing feedback, but also the context of how they was implemented. But with majority success of where these streets or at least the Healthy Streets Initiative has been put in place. When it comes to our general pattern of vehicle traffic around the region, what we're seeing is that for a lot of the major roadways that are used for pass-through traffic for cities, they're about back to pre-pandemic volume levels. And that's consistent through most cities around in our region. But But what is interesting about it is that although those major corridors are seeing the same levels of volume, all the local circulation routes are actually still down to about 60 to 80% of pre-pandemic traffic volume. And so a local example of kind of the differences is Front Street through downtown was actually back at normal traffic volumes back in July. But what we've seen is that people are traveling at different times of the day. And so a typical afternoon travel time is, 4 to 6 p.m., give or take. But now it's looking like more 1 to 9 p.m. Those volumes have actually spread out more through the day, but the total daily volume is about the same as before the pandemic. And so we've seen this huge shift in how people are traveling, and more so with essential workers need to get through a lot of the cities. And we've seen the shift of when people are working because of the enforcement of work from home policies, but also the changes of employers doing staggered shifts and any other changes to kind of work through the mitigated circumstances for the pandemic. And so what I'd like to do now, unless there's any questions, is kind of go into the discussion portion of if there's any ideas that the city can take on in early 2021 to help address the issues from the pandemic. And would it be helpful if actually I stopped showing my screen?
You're not showing it now. Did you want to start showing it?
Frankly, I never saw it, but we
Oh,
followed your conversation, I think.
okay.
I think
I have it
all
up
of
on
us,
my other screen, so I know what you're talking about. But
we were tracking, yeah, and we got it in the packet.
Well, my apologies. I thought it showed that it was sharing. Okay, so I will end this.
I don't see anyone in the chat. Does anyone raise their hands and say they want to? Marisol serves with me on the recovery task force, and so she may be, may know most what they're looking for, and I'm looking for any of you who would like to make
I mean,
suggestions.
the only thing I've noticed living, south of downtown is probably a lot more people walking, and that's probably the biggest change I've seen. I've seen more biking groups, but weekend bikers, but on a day-to-day basis, it's just a lot more people walking, living else.
I would say that everywhere people are walking everywhere. I mean, I see it. I live in Issaquah, and people are walking every day just to get some exercise. Right? That's the only thing that we can do. And I feel that these are changes that we all have been doing that perhaps will keep up. Like people have noticed that perhaps going down to downtown, you can do it and just go down and go back up. And the thing is everything is actually made up for you to drive. There are not many side roads or pathways. Sorry, I'm trying to find a word where you can just walk if you have a stroller, or they are not all the same, space or whatever, and they are not open and accessible for everybody. So that those are the things that perhaps we should be looking into. Also with this, I mean, with the streetery, is that more people are going downtown, and downtown is so long, and then when you go and you try to cross the street, I mean, I don't know if we have ever have heard anything from people who are needed of more time when they are crossing the street. They have a specific time, and I don't know a lot about it, and I'm fortunately enough to being able to walk the street with the time that they are giving you, but sometimes you have to run. And I always wonder that people are, like on a wheelchair, or if they have, when you break your whatever, you twist your ankle and you're on all those little rolling thingies. I don't know if you're going as fast. So I don't know. Those are the things that I have think about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Sujata, anything right now? Cynthia? I called your name Cynthia, but it wasn't because of you.
I was just going to say that
No
that's
right
funny
answer.
because one of my things I really like to do, and I think I'm good at, is framing problems and lobbing it over the fence to the creative people that are going to solve the problem. And so I'm not very good with like the spontaneous ideas. I mean, sometimes I'm walking around and something occurs to me through use, but yeah, I'm not I like framing problems, letting someone else solve them.
I'd like to contribute. Being inspired, I didn't think of this until I was listening to Marisol and Tom. But another thing, it's interacting with another topic on my mind is that is pedestrian prioritized traffic signal things. You know, we have the traffic signals set up to be intelligent for cars, but do they? You know, sometimes I go to a crosswalk, and it's especially frustrating when it's just a pedestrian signal like the one up at the Park and Ride on Highlands Drive. And I push the light to say I want to cross, and I have to stand there for the longest time. And I know that I'm more patient than most. A lot of people just walk right through. But if in this era of increased walking and pedestrians, if, to Marisol's point, the crossing is assured to be long enough for anybody, and that when somebody pushes the light for them, that it's signaling that a pedestrian wants to go, let's change the light for the pedestrian, not just let's indicate the white light when we let the green cars go. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. I almost said that. It was the one thing I was going to say, because just this afternoon at 4:00, I was rushing back for a meeting on Front Street at Dogwood, and that exact thing happened. And I know that thing is on some kind of timer, because early in the morning I push it, it turns immediately. But in the afternoon, when the cars are lined up on Front Street, it takes a very long time, and it favors letting the motorists go through. And there were several of us standing there for what seemed like an eternity, and I was almost late for a meeting, and I was like, I gotta go. But that was the one thing I was gonna say, is just maybe really fine-tuning that signaling to reflect and even reward the increase in pedestrian mobility.
Yeah, the signals have, I mean, there's a progression, they're trying to get a progression of vehicles through.
I get it, yeah.
What would help would be if when you push the signals, have a little timer. So at least you know that it actually did send a code to the box, and you're not going to stand there forever, but have a timer so people can see at the time. And that gives them a sense of like, okay, I know when it's going to turn, as opposed to not knowing when it's going to turn. And you can add those to head buttons, I think. So.
Yeah, and one of the things I was thinking about is with the streetery, because you know you shut down a lot of the streets and it becomes one way, and you know, so we're already sort of changing our traffic patterns and use down there. And so, you know, one of the things we were going one day and it was super crowded and trying to find parking, and we were like, gosh, there's a lot of people. And so one of the things we were wondering, or I was thinking about, is I wonder if using a facility like the Issaquah Park and Ride, and then sort of creating a safe streets route for bicyclists or whatever. So, you know, if we're investing our non-motorized infrastructure into really creating a bikeable, walkable downtown Issaquah, then maybe we could, as summer is approaching, or in the spring when the weather's better, when, you know, the streetery is going again, you know, use those Friday through Sunday, you know, changes at Front Street, but then maybe spread that influence out to some of the other parts of downtown, and then create, like, you know, sort of essentially for people who aren't very adventurous, sort of create and say, okay, you can park here, and then we'll, you know, have delineators or walkways and use a portion of the street. So we've widened the pedestrian area, and you'd walk a quarter of a mile and you'd follow this thing. And so it's almost not just about getting to the place, but it's also about the experience of walking through downtown Issaquah and maybe being a pedestrian in a part of your city that you've never been a pedestrian in, and exploring some of the other shops, or, you know, stopping at the donut place on the way, or, you know, whatever it may be. But that could be something that, since we already know we're going to have impact to traffic from the streetery, could we start expanding that ring of impact and maybe creating some opportunities for people to to walk and learn how to walk in their city.
Super. That's
I
a great
I love
suggestion.
that. So that I'm sorry. I love that idea, and it makes me think because like right now we are all learning a lot about ourselves and what our likes and dislikes are, and if you will like walking, I mean, what about if we park by the community center, but we don't really know how to get to, I don't know, the Mexican place in Front Street. How do we get there? I mean, is there any signage that we can use and let people know that this is the way you get there? How these signages in, I mean, parts of where the touristic places where they tell you like 5 minutes to the downtown, or I mean, it's super close, but people don't know, and we'll make them think about that. And I mean, I really appreciate that thought, because if people park by, if they park by Gilman Village, it will make people know that there is a lot more to see from Issaquah, and you can easily walk all the way Rainier Avenue to get to the Front Street. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a interesting, exploring your city at a street level gives you, you wind up looking at shops or seeing things that you're like, I didn't know that existed. So, but, I know during the streetery, the site, parts of the sidewalks where people were parking to go there were pretty crowded. So if we could sort of create these temporary walking paths that are wider than the natural street for those during those times, it could maybe help with more pedestrian circulation.
Yes, and that social distancing you need when you're out walking around. These are great ideas, temporary pedestrian ways, not just places for merchants, but places for people to walk. And you guys inspire an idea from me. I was on the wayfinding group. John and Stephen might know about the wayfinding group. Now I can't remember what we were called, advisory group or something. Oh, steering committee. We were a steering committee, and that project went on hold when the pandemic hit, and staffing and all these issues and the ability to have meetings was challenged. But you know what? What you guys are saying is that for recovery, we could look at the pedestrian-oriented wayfinding part, the pedestrian-oriented part of our wayfinding system, and implement that sooner in order to support this walking, this connectivity between these economic centers in our city. Because it is those walkers who are actually going to go in the door rather than the guy who's driving down the street and going somewhere else. So maybe that's a thought, is to bring back that wayfinding, prioritizing pedestrians for the recovery. Anybody else?
No, I'm glad you added the, because I was just thinking in general to something during the recovery. So I think back to what Cynthia was saying about trying to reduce the throughput traffic. If you reduce it by 10 seconds, would you get an easier crosswalk time to get through and enhance the walking side of it, as opposed to the throughput side of it for the recovery part.
Stephen, I think we might have given you some ideas to take back. Do you report that up to the recovery task force, or where do they go from here?
So what I'll do quickly, I'll try to summarize everything I heard to make sure I got everything, and then I'll write up a summary and send it out to Cynthia and Nina for kind of finalization before I send it off to the mayor and the recovery task force. So what I heard is wayfinding, kind of bringing back that whole effort for increasing the wayfinding for the city, specifically around downtown and downtown streetery. Do we want to broaden that to city destinations, or for right now, being that it's looking at the first 6 months of 2021, just kind of focus it around downtown Issaquah? And then the other effort that I heard was looking at other opportunities to widen pathways, whether temporary or maybe potentially permanent, to increase that access to downtown Issaquah. Is that consistent? Okay. Did I miss anything? It sounded like kind of those two main things. The other other part was, so I kind of talked about like the Healthy Streets Initiative, where you look at street closures to increase opportunities for people to walk outside. Marisol, you kind of spoke a little bit to that. Is that along the lines of what you were talking about? Do we want to add that to the list of recommendations or discuss that more?
I would say yes.
Okay.
I feel like it's important, not only for one. I mean, I feel like many of, not only Squaw Mountain needs this.
Okay. All right, so that's three main items that staff will flesh out a little bit more and then summarize and send it to Nina and Cynthia for review. And that's wayfinding, temporary permanent pathways, consistent or at least in coordination with the downtown streetery, and then kind of a healthy streets initiative idea of pursuing potential neighborhood street closures to kind of expand areas where people can go walk and ride a bike outside and feel safe. Is that?
The only thing that didn't get captured was, and I don't know if it's just because it's not feasible because you just got to move the front street traffic through, but just the idea of maybe visiting this signalization to reward or respond to the increase in pedestrian.
Yes, and maybe John could speak a little bit more to the feasibility of that, but that's my fault. I missed that on the list. I'm adding that.
I'll add, we'll definitely look at it.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you, John. So you've got a report. You'll send it to us. We'll give it the, yes, this is from us, and then you'll send it to them. Sounds good? The next item on our agenda is the board schedule for the rest of this year and briefly about 2021. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about when new members of the board will be welcomed. And keeping it quick, though. Again, I'm cutting you so short because we spent time. But I'm so glad we spent time, and I want to thank everybody about spending time on Complete Streets, because this we worked on for so long, and now we're finally moving it along in the process, and so it was worth the investment. Sorry about cutting you short again, Stephen, but here you go.
Oh, it's okay. I'm actually going to turn to John really quick to kind of give a brief overview for 2021, but then kind of open the table for everyone else.
Okay. Thanks, Stephen. Right now, Stephen and I are working on the tab recruitment, and the first meeting will be a special meeting in January to go over basically the policies and procedures and all that kind of stuff. And then just kind of walking down some of the highlights on the schedule for 2021. The biggest one will be the Transportation Improvement Program, that the tab will be working to redo that, and that'll take up about most of the first half of the year. Also in the spring, the tab will look at the pedestrian crossing guidelines. 2 times during the year, the tab will look at the city street standards, and that's anticipated to be in the spring and in the fall. Late summer 2021, the Transportation Advisory Board will look at traffic calming, and then in September, the schedule has it that the tab will look at transit, and the end of the year will conclude by reviewing the mobility master plan. And those are the highlights for next year for the tab.
Thank you, John. And did I miss it, or did somebody say something about December meeting?
Oh, a good one. I saw that the December meeting is going to be canceled.
Okay, because on the schedule it still shows it's on, so that will be canceled then?
Yes, yeah, we after discussion with Nina about it, it made sense that we just canceled the December meeting, just because we didn't have a sufficient enough agenda for the board to meet.
Okay.
So the next meeting will be aimed for mid-January for training, but also for introductions with the new board members, and then we'll have our regular scheduled meeting in January as well.
Okay, excellent. Anything else on the schedule, or shall we move into reports? If we are, I'll move to staff report. Stephen, do you have a report tonight?
Yeah, a very brief one. We are welcoming our new Public Works Director, Bob, who just joined us tonight. I'll let him introduce himself and say hi if he's listening.
Well, first of all, it's a real honor to be elected as Public Works Director.
You're breaking up a bit,
You
Bob.
know me. You have a great staff with Stephen and John to represent my interests. And
Bob, your audio is breaking out a bit.
I don't live in the pardon me? City problem. And so if I'm sitting here on Cougar Mountain as a, so if you can't hear me, I apologize, but let's say briefly, I'm happy to have this.
I think we lost you, Bob. It's all right. Well, so Bob's our new Public Works Director. We're happy to have him on board, and feeling better about kind of filling a lot of the spots for Public Works and feeling good about kind of moving into 2021. The other quick announcement is that we're having a new senior transportation engineer who's going to be starting on December 1st. So we're even filling out more of our team. And as John said, for board recruitment, so far we received 7 applications as of Tuesday. I'll be checking tomorrow again and doing kind of final review. Interviews will be on November 30th and December 1st, and then we'll be moving for city council appointments on December 7th.
Question?
Go ahead, Tom.
Did you get, I saw in your email that a lot of youth members hadn't responded. Did you have any chance?
We have so far. I haven't checked today, but we as of, or at least as of Tuesday, I didn't see any youth applications yet. But like I said, I haven't checked today, and so I'll be checking tomorrow and kind of working through that.
Okay.
Thank you, Stephen. And
Sorry, one last thing for the staff report.
Yes,
Additionally, for the board, we're going to be looking at potentially adding equity training for all boards and commissions. And so having deeper discussions about that and how that may apply for all our boards and commissions and kind of what city goals are around that as well. So that's one thing to look forward to in 2021.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Bob, and welcome to the City of Issaquah Transportation. We have fun here. I'm looking forward to your connection improving, though you're on Cougar, so now I worry. But we'll have fun with you in the future.
If you can hear me, I'm having Comcast problems, so I'm apologizing for that. And but I am committed to make mobility work, and I have a great team working for me, including Stephen and John, and another new person that we're just getting ready to bring on board. Sorry about the connectivity. It's a Comcast issue, which is another one of my problems. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob. Next is the chair report, and I have a report this time. I don't usually, but I do have a report. I believe this is my last meeting with the Transportation Advisory Board. I am, and I still need to write you a letter, I suppose, Stephen, but it's just, I'm procrastinating. I put myself forward for the Planning Policy Commission, and since I was accepted, I had to say I can't do both. And sometimes in my life, I guess I can, but that's just way too many meetings. So I'm going to move over to planning, and there are intersecting sets. So the things that we learned together while we were on the Transportation Advisory Board of these last 2 years, I'm certainly going to take with me over to planning. And I just want to thank you. This is my last meeting with you as a group, but I know that I'll be seeing you guys around. It's been fun working with you. Cynthia, do you have anything for the
I got nothing, but I've been stunned since you mentioned it. So I don't know how we'll get along without you, Nina. You're really good at keeping us on track and just, yeah, it's thank you for all of your service. You've been a great part of this, a real leader on this board, and it's really appreciated.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you very much. Oh,
Agree.
thank you, Tom. Yeah, thank you, Marisol and Sujata. Well, you can thank me for ending on time, which I think we might actually do. No, when we were halfway through that complete streets, I didn't think that was going to happen. Any other business? We already talked about the next meeting in December is canceled, but Stephen, do you have on the tip of your tongue the date of that January meeting?
I don't, but I'll be reaching out to schedule.
Is it the same kind of schedule that we have this year?
Yeah, on the calendar, it shows January 25th, at least on the draft.
Yeah,
schedule.
currently our schedule will still be looking at the fourth Mondays of each month, but since we're going to be getting a significant amount of new members, we'll be reaching out to them to make sure that schedule still works for them, or to find out if we need to make any adjustments. So I'll reach out to everybody on the schedule.
Okay, great. So if I'm not seeing anything else, that means I need to adjourn. So tonight, thank you, adjourning the Transportation Advisory Board meeting of November 19th at 7:59. So good night, everybody, and thank you for the great work tonight.
Thank you, Nina.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen.